Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm very excited for today's video because I get to be ranty and I get to hate on a lot of things, and we all know that just a little bit of hate can be very fun and cathartic. Today is my worst books of 2018 video. I have 8 books on this list, plus one author, and I've sort of ordered them from least irritating to most irritating as I feel now. I didn't do any specific rankings or anything, I just sort of put them in roughly the order of which they most annoy me. All of these received 2 stars except for one which received 1 star, but I do feel like there are an additional 3 that also probably deserved 1 star, so I will talk about those when I get to them. This whole video is going to be spoiler free except for the last 2 books, which I will remind you again when I get there. Those will have spoilers because I really couldn't talk about my issues with them without spoilers. But again, I will warn you once I get there. And just a reminder, just because these are the worst books for me doesn't mean they are or should be the worst books for you. The first book on this list is Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. This just barely made the list. I didn't hate this book as much as I hated some of the other books on here, but it was the most disappointing. This was the book I had the most high hopes for, and this was the one that let me down the most. Although I did really dislike this book. This is a young adult historical fiction novel about the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. It follows 3 refugees and a Nazi officer who all wind up on the boat together. Basically, the story goes from there. The thing that crushed me with this book was the short chapters. I don't usually mind short chapters. I mean, I prefer longer, but I can get through short chapters because I just continue reading and they flow together. But this book changed perspective every chapter, and each chapter was 2 pages long, on average. And I'm not exaggerating that. If you look at the book, on average, each chapter was 1 to 3 pages long, and I think there was one chapter that was 5 pages, and I got really excited over that. I could not get into this story. It felt so choppy because of the short chapters, and it irritated me. I couldn't get a feel for any of the characters. I wound up having to memorize their names because their specific personalities never came through for me. And that wasn't to say that their personalities weren't there, it was just because I was only allowed a page or 2 inside their heads at a time before I switch and go to these 3 other characters, I never really got a feel for who they were as people. And it was so disappointing because I did go into this book really expecting to love it, and then as soon as I realized there were short chapters, I almost DNF'd it. And it was just so disappointing, but I did get through the whole book. I got through all of these books. I only DNF'd 2 books this year, and neither of them were because they were bad, so all the books on this list I did finish in their entirety. And I don't know, this book, it just barely makes the list, but I did really dislike it. It's one of those things where I don't understand all the hype. I get that some people can get through those really short chapters and perspective changes, but it surprises me that there aren't more people who have an issue with it for that reason. Because I really wanted to love this book. It sounded like it was my kind of thing because I do love World War II historical fiction, and it wasn't. It was so awful. It was such an awful experience. I do have a rant review up for this book if you want to hear about my thoughts in more detail. I will link that down below, as well as any other reviews I have for these books, if you're interested in more of an in-depth analysis. The second book was A Walk Across the Sun by Corban Addison. This had the most gorgeous cover, and that was kind of why I picked it up in a thrift shop. It looked like it could be the kind of book that was either really good or really cringy, and because it had a pretty cover, I decided to go with it, and it was really cringy. I gave this book 2 stars as well. It is about 2 Indian sisters who wind up getting trafficked into sex slavery after their family is killed, and then a white American who makes it his crusade to rescue them. The book follows the 3 characters as they are on their separate journeys, although the one sister pretty much gets written out of the story very quickly, and it winds up being mostly about the white man who's trying to save them. And the story as a whole just felt like white savior trope to the extreme. The main character, whose name I don't remember, honestly, and I don't know that I remembered his name when I actually filmed my review on this book, he was the author. It was a self-insert book. If you looked at the author and who he was as a person, he was a Virginia native who was a lawyer, went to the same school as his main character, worked for an organization to fight sex trafficking just like his main character. He was exactly the same as his main character. And his main character went through a lot of things. He was having difficulties with his wife, and they'd had a child who was stillborn or died of SIDS or something. I don't really remember, but I never cared about his story, and it seemed like his story was the bulk of the story, and it was just cringy. It was so cringy. I didn't like this book, and the writing was like over the top flowery. Like he was trying really hard to write this like beautiful, elegant literary fiction novel, and it just wound up being really trying too hard and cringy and awful. And this was his debut novel, and I did see that Kieran over from Key Reads read one of his other books, and I think that was like one of his favorite books of the year. I don't know that I would go out of my way to read that book, but I do think that if I picked it up in a thrift store, I didn't hate this one enough that I wouldn't give it another try if it sounded interesting, but this book just felt so awful to me. Books 3 and 4 on this list go together. I gave them both 2 stars, and I listened to the audiobook for both of them. And they are The Girl Who Takes an Eye for an Eye and The Girl in the Spider's Web, both by David Lagercrantz. These are books 4 and 5 in the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo series. I did read the original 3, and then I read these 2. I did not like these books, but I didn't like the original trilogy either. I don't remember the plots of these books, so I can't really talk about them, but it's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Elisabeth Salander is basically an autistic savant. It never literally stated, but it's heavily implied throughout the books, especially in these 2, that she is autistic, and she works with a journalist named Michael Blomkvist, and basically they're all about sexual violence against women. And my main issue with these books, well, I had several. Overall, I do not like this series. I gave the first 2 books 2 stars, the third one 1 star, and then books 4 and 5 that I read this year, I gave them both 2 stars. They seem more like they're fetishizing violence against women, and they seem like sexism as written from the viewpoint of a man. They have no nuance when it comes to the sexism. Every man is either this evil Nazi woman hater who would literally like rape and kill women if he could get away with it, or he's a lovely man. And there's no in between. There's no nice guy at work who's like casually a little bit sexist. And it's not nuanced at all. And then, you know, the main character has sex with pretty much every woman in the story, which is very cringe. And I do think almost literally he has sex with every woman who's not already dead. I do think books 4 and 5 are better than Stieg Larsson's books. I did think they improved, but they weren't good. They were just comparatively not as bad. I do think if you like the first 3, there's definitely a character shift. Blomkvist and Elisabeth are not the same characters that they were in the first 3 books, but I felt like the changes were slightly for the better. They were less annoying. The books were slightly less sexist. There was actually more discussion on autism, which I really appreciated, but these books were still awful. They were such a drag to get through, and I really don't like these characters, I don't like these stories, and I don't think they're well done. And I really don't understand why they get so much love, because they just seem awful and like borderline offensive and just like terrible books overall. Number 5 is the author who made this list, and I put her on here because I didn't think any of her books individually deserved to make the list, but I read 5 of her books this year and I didn't really like any of them. That is Tawni O'Dell. I believe she is best known for Backroads, which might have been her debut, I don't remember. I read 5 of her 6 novels, and I don't know why. Actually, I do know why. I went to the library and was randomly browsing and picked up one of her books and was like, oh, this seems kind of interesting. Noticed there were 4 more on the shelf, picked them up as well, and then I went home. Didn't like Backroads, which was the first one I read of hers. And then I read the second one. Didn't like it either. And then instead of being a normal person and returning those books to the library, I read the other 3. And I didn't like any of her books. I did give some of them 3 stars, but it was more like they barely hit 3 stars. It was just, I didn't actively dislike them. But overall, her writing was very flowery, and I felt like that didn't fit with her characters, because most of her characters were very uneducated from small towns in West Virginia, I believe, or, you know, other coal towns. It was like this very flowery, beautiful writing from the perspective of these people who could barely have coherent sentences. And I didn't like that, and I didn't like the stories. A lot of them were about, like, sexual violence and, like, lots of incest that I didn't expect, and they were very dark, but not, like, interesting dark. They were just, like, dark, terrible people doing dark, terrible things, and in a kind of boring way. I don't tend to like the dark, gritty, country, small town type things, and her books just, they very much rubbed me the wrong way. I didn't think she was quite as terrible as the books I'm about to get to, because we're about to hit the point of everything after here is truly, truly awful. But all of her books just sort of like made me want to never read her again. And it bothers me that I read 5 of her 6 novels, but I'm not going to read the 6th one just to have finished all her books. Backroads was an Oprah book club book, and it was just sort of like, yeah, it was about like a lot of bad things that happened to a lot of people, and there was a lot of like, ooh, plot twist incest, plot twist rape. I don't like when those things are really used for shock value, as I felt like they were in her books, all of her books. They were just like really melodramatic in that way. This next book is sort of the turning point of the list. It's sort of like the one that's on the line between I didn't like these books and these were the worst books I've ever read. And that is, ooh, I forgot. What is it? The Devil You Know by Elisabeth de Mariaffi. This book I do not remember in the slightest, and that's kind of why it's on this list. I gave it 2 stars, and I really have to look up my Goodreads review because I don't remember a single thing about this book. Basically, a young rookie crime reporter decides to solve the 10-year-old murder of her best friend, and that's it, basically. There's like a romance, I believe, with one of her old friends, and there are a lot of weird things that happen, but mostly I felt like the story didn't make sense as a story. Like, it felt so disconnected and weird, and like, it's not hard to write a thriller that just like is a story. Like, it didn't feel like a story. Everything felt so disconnected and nothing made sense. It was like I was forgetting what I was reading and what was going on as I was reading it. Like, it makes sense to have forgotten about this book that I read like probably last spring, but I was forgetting about it as I was reading it, and that was pretty much all I remembered from this book. In my review, I actually used the word soulless, which was kind of mean, but also true. Like, it felt like this book was, like, written by a computer or something. Like, it had all the events, but nothing really, like, made sense for the characters or the story or, like, from a real-life standpoint. I don't remember what happened, so, like, even if I wanted to, like, spoil this book, I literally couldn't. There was, like, a murder, and there was, like, someone stalking her, I believe, but I don't know if the person was stalking her or if it was like her friend, because it felt like one of those books where it might be. I don't remember this book at all. Like, even reading the Goodreads summary does not really help much. Maybe I was just missing something here, but I gave this book 2 stars just because I was like, what did I read? We're now getting into the final 4. I gave 3 of these 4 books 2 stars, but honestly, at the point where I am now, I kind of feel like all 4 of these books deserve 1 star. And I do have reviews for 2 of the 4. So I will link them down below with the other reviews, so feel free to go check them out if you want to hear me rant even more. First of these 4 worst books, we have Fractured by Kate Watterson. I don't really remember the plot of this book, I'm gonna be honest. And I skimmed the Goodreads summary and I still couldn't really make sense of it, so I'm not gonna describe the plot at all. But it is a thriller. I believe there's like a murderer who's like killing men who look a certain way. The main character is a therapist. Basically, what I remember from this book was that it felt like it was written in the 80s, in the sense that everything was like super cringe, and she'd like use words that aren't acceptable anymore. Like, she used the word cripple to describe people, and it's like, that's not really something we use anymore. And the way mental illness was talked about, and she used the word asexuality once, and I got briefly excited, and then she was like, we just have to figure out if you're asexual because it's trauma-based or it's a physical defect. I was like, what? And this book was published in 2015. And it just, like, kept using all these, like, sexist tropes. Like, the man couldn't cook, and, like, they were treating that like it was a funny thing. Like, he had his one easy dish that he could cook, and that was it. And the whole book was just, like, full of these, like, kind of sexist, kind of homophobic, kind of ableist, kind of like crappy things about mental illnesses, because the main character was a therapist, and like, it felt like it was written in the 80s, and I kept checking to be like, this is from 2015, right? Like, this isn't acceptable for 2015. And that's really all I remember, but I do remember not liking the story as well. It was just like, this book was like one long cringe. And it has such good reviews on Goodreads, and that was just one of those situations where I was like, how? Like, how could anyone like this book? Like, why are you guys, like, forgiving this book? This book was awful. Like, everything about it was just like, I hated this book. I gave it 2 stars at the time, but it's one of those books that, like, I'm not changing the rating of it, but like in hindsight, I kind of feel like it deserves 1 star based on just how much it's pissing me off all these months later. Then we have Little Girl Gone by Gerry Schmitt, and there are a lot of thrillers on this list I'm just now realizing. I went through like a big thriller kick for like the first 6 months of the year, so like most of what I read was thrillers, and I tend to be very picky about thrillers anyway, but I also feel like picking up random thrillers, it's very easy to find like truly terrible writers in that genre. Like there are a bunch of amazing thrillers, and I do have some on my best list that will be coming out next week, but I feel like in general it's really easy to find like terrible thrillers. So Little Girl Gone by Gerry Schmitt. This I remember slightly more, and everything I remember about it is negative. And I remember someone asking me on my review video of this why I didn't give it 1 star. And in hindsight, I don't know. This book was awful. It's billed as like a typical whodunit thriller. You know, like someone kidnaps a baby and the cops are like, oh no, who did it? It looks like this might have happened before. And they start investigating. And that's sort of the entire description of this book, which is halfway true. This woman who is an associate of the cops, I forget her exact role, but she wasn't actually a cop. They were investigating the kidnapping of this infant. Typical, you know, typical kind of thriller thing. It wasn't that terrible. But the thing is, there was no whodunit aspect, because the book is told in dual perspective. Half from the cops, and then half from the kidnappers. The cop half is what you would expect from a typical thriller. They're investigating, they're tracking down all these leads, they're like building suspense with all these red herrings. But it doesn't work, because then you have the other half of the story, which is from the kidnappers. So from the beginning, like literally from the first page, you know exactly who the kidnappers are. You know exactly what they want. Which means that when the cops are investigating, there's literally no suspense. It's just boring because it's like, well, I, the reader, know exactly what's going on. Not because I predicted anything, not because I made educated guesses, but you've literally told me exactly what's going on. So watching these cops track down all these random people and like interview them and be like, oh, I think I know what's going on. It's this woman who's having an affair with the husband. It's like, well, no, it's not. It has nothing to do with that, and we know it has nothing to do with that. So there's literally no suspense. And then beyond that, the book was just like poorly written with irritating characters and, you know, the stereotypical bad thriller stuff. I didn't like it, but usually with bad thrillers, even if they're bad, the suspense and the whodunit aspect is enough to like push me through to the ending and be like, okay, whatever, that was fine. You know, like even when something is truly terrible, it's like, well, I still care about what happened in the ending. And with this book, I didn't. Because you knew what happened, you knew who did it, and that was pretty much it. And I don't understand why she thought this book was a good idea. Like, if you're going to tell the reader who did it from the beginning, that's fine. I've read books that do that very well. But then you have to have a different story. You have to sort of explore the characters. It has to be more character-driven than suspense-driven. And this was just suspense-driven, but there was no suspense. So, in hindsight, probably a 1-star read. Now we're getting down to my last 2 reads. There will be minor spoilers ahead. I'm going to be talking about What She Left by T.R. Richmond, as well as It's Always the Husband by Michele Campbell. So if you want to read either of these 2 books, I am going to ruin both of these, and they're both thrillers. So if you care, here's your warning. Please click off. So What She Left by T.R. Richmond. This is not the final book on this list, but it is the only book this year that I actually gave 1 star at the time. This is the story of Alice Salmon, as told by this creepy, sexist, abusive professor who was, like, weirdly in love with her and her mother. That's this book. He uses, like, her diary entries and her emails, and he, like, gets in contact with, like, her family and her friends and, like, interviews people and, like, is writing this book about her, like, within the story. And it's, like, so cringe. Like, he was in love with her mother, like, he had an affair with her or something, and then, like, when Alice was in college, he, like, fell in love with her as, like, this creepy old man, and it was the creepiest thing. And not in, like, a good way. Like, there's, like, good creepy in thrillers where it's like, ooh, this is making me feel creeped out. And then there's, like, you're supposed to relate to this character, but I don't because he's a creepy asshole. This book had a lot of male characters like that. Every male character in this book was this creepy, abusive pervert. And it was kind of written in the way, like, it was an apologist for these men. It was, like, explaining why they're like this, and, like, oh, but they're not that bad because they didn't actually cause Alice's death. Because Alice's death was caused by a woman. Like, go figure. Of course this book was written by a man, and I read a couple of thrillers that were written by men. Not all of them made this list. This was the only one I think that made this list. The others were all written by women. And it's just, when men write thrillers about women, and like women are like the main focal point of their thrillers, it tends to be all about sexual violence. It tends to feel more like fetishizing than when women write about sexual violence in thrillers. And it's just like very cringe. And I feel like after this book, I kind of was like, let's not read any more thrillers by men for a while, because I don't need this anymore. This book was just like the worst. It was also told out of order. Like, he would use like random diary entries from different dates. Like, this one would be from like 2 years ago, and then there'd be one from like 8 years ago, and then one from like 5 years ago, and like the emails were out of order as well. And I can't get into stories like that. They just don't work with the way my brain works. I can't like put everything in order in my mind. It just stays out of order, and I'm very confused by that. So maybe this would have been 2 stars if I had been able to like get through that aspect. But God, I hated this book. God, I hated this book. I think in my review I said something like, if there was ever a book that was a complete and utter waste of time, it was this one. And I still feel that way. Like, months and months later. I think I read this in like February or something. It was so awful. Just like so truly awful. I can't imagine what anyone would ever get out of this book. And God, I hated it. Just so much. The very final book that I think was probably the worst book I read this year, as I remember it now. It's Always the Husband by Michele Campbell. Fair warning, I'm going to spoil this book really badly. Even worse than with the previous book. I'm going to completely ruin this book for you, so if you don't want to be ruined, please go away. The thing about this book, and why it makes me so angry, because overall, it was a fairly generic bad thriller. Like, the characters were annoying. I didn't like any of them. I didn't really care about the story. I didn't think the writing was all that well done. Blah, 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 you know. It was generic. It was bad. But the thing that truly pissed me off about this book is the title. It's Always the Husband. So who do you think did it? It's the husband. Duh. I don't know. Like, I don't understand how anyone could ever enjoy this book. Of course the husband did it. It's in the title. Like, how could you ever be surprised by the plot twist? Because it is treated as a plot twist within the story. They're like the last few pages, oh my god, the husband did do it. Major plot twist. What a shock to everyone reading this book called It's Always the Husband, that the husband actually did it. Like, I don't understand how anyone could ever be shocked by that. Like, going into this book, you know it's going to be the husband. Like, it can't possibly be anyone other than the husband in a book called It's Always the Husband. I wouldn't have liked this thriller with a different title, but the title was just like, why? Literally, why would you title this book that? How does that make any sense, even remotely? It just pissed me off so much. Like, I think I would have just forgotten this book if it wasn't for the title. Like, I don't even know if it would have made it on this list, because the only reason I remember it is the title. Because I was just reading it, like, thinking, okay, when's it going to be the husband? Because we know it's going to be the husband, and then it was, and it was treated like we were supposed to be surprised by that, and it's called It's Always the Husband. I don't understand how anyone thought that was a good idea. It baffles me. I'm so confused. Like, why? Of course it was the husband. Of course. I don't have a review for this book, but if I did have a review for this book, it would probably just be me saying, of course it was the husband for 10 straight minutes, because of course it was the frickin' husband. I don't understand. That may not have been the actual worst book I read this year, but that was definitely the one that pissed me off the most, and that's pretty much just what this book was. The list of books that were the most irritating and the most annoying, and what I remember now, because a lot of these have very much faded, so take this list for what you will, and honestly, like, no shade on anyone who likes any of these books. That's absolutely fine. Like, we can have different tastes in books and we can both be right. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, if you agree or disagree, or I don't know. I think the most popular book I have on here is probably Salt to the Sea, and I don't know how many of the trash thrillers people will have read, but I would love to talk about them and rant in the comments or have disagreements, because I love disagreements. Let me know down below what some of your worst books of the year were. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.